Let's turn to our third presentation, which is entitled Work-Study Practices in New Hampshire, Validation Dialogues Between Practice and Research Expertise. And let's welcome Anthony Doucet from Souhegan High School, Paul Leather from the National Center for Innovation in Education, Felicia Sullivan from Jobs for the Future, Jonathan Vander and Kathy White from the New Hampshire Learning Initiative, and Nicole Woulfe from Sanborn Middle School.
Great. Thank you, Elliot. This is Felicia Sullivan from JFF. You've already introduced our team. So if you could go to the next slide, and my colleague Kathy White will kick us off.
Thank you, Felicia. So just to give you a little bit of the context and the big picture of the work that's been happening in New Hampshire, in 2005, competency-based education was established by law. In 2015, New Hampshire received a waiver from the U.S. Education Department to be able to implement the performance assessment of competency-based education as an alternative accountability system, and that we refer to as PACE. And within a few years, and now work-study practices were not assessed as part of those initial PACE assessments. However, they were focused on the content competencies in ELA, science, and math. Meanwhile, the New Hampshire Department of Education implemented professional learning and community of practices around the work-study practices. Now, we call them work-study practices in New Hampshire. You may know them as 21st century skills, and you may know them as deeper learning competencies. And we use the essential skills and disposition as our framework, as our research base. Next slide. So our work study practices are self-direction, collaboration, creativity, and communication. Next slide. Our research practice partnership initially began with 4 districts that are in the research, for formal research. And those districts were also PACE districts. They are Sanborn, Rochester, Souhegan, and Laconia. Next. Teachers from those first 4 districts also joined teachers from 6 other districts in New Hampshire to work on the work study practice task development work. And we focused on social studies as the content area for this work. Rubrics were developed in this project and were implemented by the PACE teachers in ELA, math, and science. And now Paul will share with you some of the background and impetus for this research in New Hampshire.
Next slide.
Next slide, sorry.
Paul, are you on mute?
Good afternoon. When this project began, I was the Deputy Commissioner at the New Hampshire Department of Education, and we were seeking to scale competency-based education across New Hampshire and to make our structures like state assessment and accountability more consistent and coherent with competency-based education. This project was really based on 2 big bets. The first was by David Conley. Most folks here may know from the University of Oregon and a longtime national expert on college and career readiness. During an informal lunch meeting 10 years ago, which was in some ways just like a number of us just had in the breakout rooms, David was spending a little time with Fritz Mosier of CPRE and Columbia University, who's also a national expert researcher on student learning progressions. And they had a discussion, and David had a pretty strong disagreement with Fritz about the developmental progression of essential skills. He thought that it would be possible to develop such a developmental framework, whereas Fritz was questioning whether that could ever be done. Well, make a long story short, this resulted in the creation of the essential skills and dispositions framework that Kathy just mentioned. And that was led by a team at EPIC by David, along with my colleague now at CIE, Sarah Lynch. The second big bet was that by using this developmental framework as the basis of New Hampshire's work study practices, and by employing the design and calibration processes in the New Hampshire PACE system, that these success skills could be reliably and validly used by both New Hampshire students and educators in classrooms through the development and use of common performance assessments across classrooms in New Hampshire. If you join our breakout, you will hear student voices and hear from teachers from the project as to how we are doing with this big bet. Next slide. Next slide. Next, oh, there we are.
This is a research practice partnership, and I think we initially started out trying to understand if teachers who came to an invitational professional learning community around work study practices, would they have better academic outcomes for their students? But we realized pretty quickly that we needed to take a step backward and really build out the assessment system for the work study practices so that they were more valid and reliable, since that's the second big bet we were trying to prove. I also want to say that our research practice partnership is, rather than just a typical RPP model where we have evidence that is then funneled into practice, that practice is informed by research. We certainly are doing that with the essential skills and disposition framework, starting from a research frame. But we also are using research in an improvement cycle loop that's between research and practice in a continuous cycle. And then we also are using research to demonstrate or communicate reliability and validity of the assessment system. So we have these three ways in which research is operating within our RPP. Next slide. So this is the example of sort of evidence use of going from the essential skills and dispositions into the PACE assessment system, which then is uptaked by teachers who work with their students, funneling the insights and framework from the ES&D down into classrooms and student assessment systems. So that's the sort of traditional model of RPP. Next slide. But we also used research and a calibration, a formative calibration process with teachers to look at our initial rubrics and evidence collection tools to see how they were operating and to what extent they were understood across different teachers in different districts, and understand which tools were working well and which weren't. This is sort of our rubric, really looking at where there was agreement and where tools were strong and where they were weak, which then informed our next iteration of design and assessment. Next slide. But what we want to focus on today, and I recognize that our research experts, Karen Hess and Wendy Sur, are in the virtual room with us today, as well as a couple of our other colleagues from NHLI, Carolyn Eastman and Marianne Grasper. But really, it's this sort of back and forth between practice expertise and research expertise that we most want to highlight. I think it's very often that research comes into settings and presents itself as having the knowledge, and that practice is then working in response to research. But this project really is using the research expertise to build from that research framework down into the classroom instruction, ensuring that there's really construct validity between the framework and all of the rubrics, tools, and instructional practices. But then at the same time, teachers and their students are funneling information back into the project about whether or not these tools resonate, work, or make sense in their own settings. And that it's that active dialogue between both bodies of expertise that have been really critical to this project. So what you'll hear in our breakout room, next slide, is you will hear from our two teacher practice experts, Anthony Doucet and Nicole Woulfe, and our practice partner, Jonathan Vander will lead them in a conversation to talk about that process of working with these tools and bringing their practice expertise to the table. And that's, we hope you join us in our breakout room.
Terrific, thank you so much. Really exciting to know that you're going into such depth with the work study practices. I know that many of us who have worked in schools or who are doing research on this are desperately wanting to find better ways of measuring this and demonstrating its importance. Thank you so much all for what you're doing with that work. And thanks very much to all three research teams who presented during this hour.